So good afternoon to those of you in the room. To those of you online, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your context. And welcome to this talk about the relationship between loneliness and spirituality. I started with this research question: what are the effects of loneliness on the spiritual lives of rural adults? I will be teasing apart each piece of this question, but that was what I decided to land on, and you'll find out why in a moment, because I will start with a story. And my story has to do with my family. I have seen the devastating effects of loneliness on my own family members. These are family members who are very close to me, and I have seen their mental and physical health deteriorate because of loneliness. However, I had an idea, and my idea was that if they had strengthened their relationship with God, that their loneliness would disappear. I saw that they didn't have a strong spirituality, and so I decided, what is the correlation? What is the relationship between these two, between this emotion and between this way of living, and how can it help people? And so I thought, my bias going into this was that if they had God, they had everything. One of my research participants also endorsed this view by saying people heal and transform and change by experiencing the love of God. I thought I was on the right track, and we'll come back to that later. So why rural? Well, there are three reasons. One is that rural areas often lack the mental and physical supports that other places enjoy. There are fewer studies that have focused on this topic in this area, in rural areas. And finally, I have my own experience in a rural context, and I wanted to bring that to the fore, and especially with the people that I interviewed who were part of my community, to give voice to their experience. I would like to turn now to Scripture. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted, cries out the psalmist. This is how I saw many of my participants. And the response from Jesus, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. How beautiful is that? My methodology was phenomenology, and this is just a big fancy word for exploring the experience of a piece, of a phenomenon. In this case, loneliness and spirituality. I conducted 9 one-on-one interviews with people from across Canada and actually internationally. 3 of them were in person, 6 of them were online in a virtual space. And the participants chose their own aliases. We have here not only the aliases that were chosen, but also their coping mechanisms, the #1 coping mechanism that they chose to tell me about. And these ones here are all icons for various ways that they dealt with their loneliness. I would like to thank my participants for their amazing candor, for their bravery, their courage in telling me their stories, and also for their time and wisdom and insights. They were amazing people. And I really appreciated not only meeting some of the ones that I had never met before, but also really going deeper into a relationship with the ones that I had met before. So these are my wonderful participants, and you will see quotes from them as we go through. So if you're wondering who is Mads, you'll know she's one of my participants, and she is amazing. Why loneliness? What about loneliness? Loneliness is something that I think is not only on the rise in our society, especially after COVID, but also has implications for physical health. I have looked at studies, and I've heard that 50% there is a risk of developing dementia that is higher by 50% if you're lonely. When it comes to heart disease, it's 29%. Stroke, 32%. So there is a real physical impact on people due to loneliness. That doesn't include all of the mental health issues, all of the difficulties people have reintegrating into society, into being with other people when they have had bouts of prolonged loneliness. But what is loneliness in the first place? Well, I don't know if you've heard this, but in the UK there is a minister for loneliness. And this is the definition that the UK is using. It's a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship. So I asked my participants, what does loneliness feel like? And this is where we're getting to the title of my talk. Many of them, almost all of them, said it's an emptiness, a hole, a deep sadness. It feels like you're broken apart. There were other answers, but they were equally gloomy. Now, I asked them where they felt loneliness in their bodies, because I don't think you can separate the mind from the body. Almost all of them pointed to this area. One actually angled the camera down, lifted the shirt, and said, "Right here." So another participant said, "It starts behind my eyes and moves down through the whole core of me." So it's a really visceral feeling. James Lewis says it's about an emptiness in my core. So I want to say my stomach, but I know that's where I feel everything. My participants identified two types of loneliness. One is chronic and the other is acute. Now, the chronic is that ongoing feeling of loneliness that lies beneath everything, and the acute are the episodes that happen periodically. And Mads described this beautifully. It's like a wave, like kind of calm, and then it bubbles up. There are also dimensions of loneliness, and this comes from Vivek Murthy's Together. Wonderful book, I recommend it to everyone. He talks about intimate or emotional loneliness. This is a longing for a close confidant or an intimate partner. Relational or social is the yearning for quality friendships or social connection, companionship, and support. And finally, there is a collective, which he calls the hunger for a network or community of people who share your sense of purpose and interests. In other words, like-minded people. I asked my participants, how often do you feel lonely? And I was astounded by the severity of the loneliness that they felt. 33% of them said always. I am always lonely. 45% said often. So this meant at least 4 times a week. That was what was described to me. So that severity was, it was really heartbreaking to hear. I asked about coping mechanisms, and there were a number of ways that people chose to address their loneliness, and in some cases to escape it or to mask it. The ways included playing music and dancing, being in nature, praying, painting, cooking, And an especially important one was performing service. And what I mean by that is joining with other people in order to do things for others that are needed. And this we'll come back to that one because it's very important in our implications. Ruth Roberts was one of the participants who identified performing service. And she says there's some sort of that feeling that everybody is working for the good. And that brings people together, makes you feel part of something bigger than yourself. This is an incredibly difficult chart to look at. Don't worry, I'm going to pull it apart, show you pieces, and if you want my slides at any time, I'm happy to share them. So on the outside, you can see, hopefully, potentially, maybe not in the room, they are the coping mechanisms, the individual coping mechanisms that people identified to me when I asked the question. But you'll also see in the center, there are two categories. There's spiritual and there's secular. And they're pretty well split down the middle. And these are identified by the participants, either explicitly saying this was a secular event, activity that I engaged in, or implicitly by, yes, I did this and the church had nothing to do with it. So these are separated by the participants themselves. I didn't put them in the categories. They put them in the categories. You'll also see in the middle section, there is individual and social. Individual and social. And this is what I'd like to point out. This is where I think the real impact of this starburst is happening. And it's seeing that in the spiritual, the majority of the coping mechanisms are done individually. They're not done in community. They're not done with other people. There were only 2 that were identified as being done with other people. However, when it comes to secular activities, there were quite a few more that were considered social, that they considered social. They were doing them with other people, and they were doing them in a place that was not a faith-based place. So that is, if you come away with anything from this great big graph, that's what I want you to remember, is that the social is not as represented as in the spiritual realm as the individual, and that is a place where churches can have some impact. Saints and sages knew a thing or two about loneliness, says Stephen Mumford. They didn't have smartphones. They actually had to live through those times. Very wise people I spoke with indeed. So what about spirituality? Well, spirituality is the relationship to self, to God, and to others. The relationship to self is primarily acceptance of our limitations as well as our gifts. To God, the attitude of trust, and to others, compassion and hospitality. And that is the definition from the Clinical Handbook of Pastoral Counseling. And I think it's a really good one. It talks a lot about relationship, and it talks a lot about not just relationship with God, but each other, which to me is key. Thank you. So when I asked, what does your spirituality look like? What does it feel like? Give me a sense of your spirit, of what you think of spirituality when I say spirituality. Some people mentioned Jesus. It's myself linked with Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit. I love this one. It's beyond comprehension in our human little brains. And for someone who identified not as being very spiritual, they said there's something, some sort of order in the chaos. So it wasn't as defined as some of the other ones, but it definitely had an impact on their lives. One wonderful participant said, "It's everything. There isn't a particle in my being that isn't spiritual." So let's get to the crux of it. What is the relationship between loneliness and spirituality? And when I asked that question, there were a number of answers, but here are just a few. "It just makes me turn to God," said one of the participants. For one of them, for whom spirituality was not as big a part of their lives, they said, "I don't think it really has much of an effect on my spirituality." And the last quote here, "It causes my spirituality to grow, and it enforces it, and it contributes to it." So there's a real correlation between the two. So you can see there's a bit of a continuum as to nothing to practically everything. I flipped that on its head and said, how does your spirituality affect your loneliness? And the answers were many, but here are a few. "It gives me hope," said one participant. "My spirituality is my sense of the connectedness of myself to everything else. I just need to turn towards it," said another. "Faith is the Band-Aid over the wound of loneliness, and it erases it completely. There's no need to be lonely when I am part of the bigger picture," said another one. And I thought, yay! I was right. I was right in my bias that, God is the cure-all. It's the panacea. And then I heard this. "I have God, and it isn't enough." And my heart broke. There's another one. Kurt continued with, "I need someone to hold me." And this was echoed by another participant who said, "Why? Why do I feel the way I feel if I have so much faith in God?" That got me thinking. And what I came up with was something I call the loneliness diagram. Oh, first of all, though, I just want to remind you of the dimensions of loneliness, which we'd seen earlier, and keep those in mind because I'm taking those and I'm rearranging them a little bit in order to make the loneliness diagram. This diagram has different corners for each of the different types of loneliness that you can, each of the different dimensions of loneliness that you can experience. So spiritual loneliness was not something that Vivek Murthy talked about, but I think is crucial to our understanding of the relationship between loneliness and spirituality. So I added God at the top. Intimate relationships, I've added off to the side. And it's really hard to read there, but it says friends and groups. So the collective and the social I put together because I felt that they had a lot of similarities and didn't need to be separated. And it's really hard to do a triangle with 4 points. Now, the Reverend Dr. Andy O'Neill pointed out that one of these points is independent of the others and cannot be replaced by another one. And that's what got me thinking, especially when one of my participants said, I have a beautiful relationship with God, I have a wonderful relationship with my spouse, but I'm still lonely because I don't have friends. So each of these is independent and does not rely on the others. You can feel loneliness in any one of these areas. There was one thing that I felt was missing, and it was mentioned by the participants, and I've added it. And it's coming, family. So family, what I found when I had my interviews with my participants was that all of the people who claim to be lonely always, and all but one of the people who claim to be lonely often, had feelings of not belonging in their families of origin, or in their families that they created. That feeling of being dislocated from your roots was throughout those participants, and everything that they talked about looped back into the sense of family. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is a correlation between the two, and I'm not suggesting that there is causation between the two. All I'm saying is that for me, it was a really interesting finding, and that it needs to be looked at further. Though my mother and father forsake me, the Lord will receive me. We have that spiritual peace that fills a little bit of that void. And we can hear way back in the scriptures that this is not something that is unique to us in our context today. Being a disciple is the way of compassion and forgiveness and acceptance and serious inclusion. And launching off of that, we come to our pastoral implications. So churches can be there for the lonely, and honestly ought to be there for the lonely, because they offer fellowship, they offer a place to belong, and they offer activities. So some of the activities that were mentioned go back to the coping mechanisms. One was cooking, so why not offer communal cooking? Teaching people how to be and make friends. Believe it or not, adults, that was a common theme. People were telling me that that was something they needed to know. Organizing nature walks, because it's a way to not only be in community, but also experience God in new ways. Expose people to different spiritual practices. Join people in service for the greater good. So we heard from Ruth how that impacts her and how she feels about her being part of a group that is working towards the greater good. So that is something that as churches is a natural fit. And finally, create opportunities for those social spiritual coping mechanisms. Doing things that can further the spiritual lives of people and coping with loneliness, that's a win-win situation. A few next steps. Further studies, as I mentioned earlier, on the relationship between family, spirituality, and loneliness, because I think that's key to some of the loneliness stories that I heard. Studies on how churches can address loneliness in youth, because youth self-identify as the most lonely population. The 15 to 24-year-olds, there are 23% who say that they are always lonely. That is astounding. And finally, conscious efforts on the part of churches to address loneliness across various populations, because various populations have different needs. The youth might not be as keen on doing chair yoga as some of the seniors. So that sort of thing. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to this presentation. God bless.